it's ironic actually, as the ability to get what you want from culture and your own version of enchantment has grown, so has Disney, and Disney has been buying up all sorts of other companies. It now owns Lucasfilm, it owns Marvel. I think it's gotten too big to actually be able to put in the time and effort to be genuinely creative.
And so I think in this world where we have these technologies and people are able to create their own meaning and create their own enchantments, something like Disney just isn't going to have the same hold over the imagination. It's not going to have that same power. In that sense, I mean, the demise of Disney and its influence is almost a bit like the decline of institutional religion.
Welcome to another episode of Re-Enchanting, the podcast from Seen and Unseen. I am Belle Tindall.
And I'm Justin Brierley.
And you know the drill by now. Please do like, share, subscribe, review, do all of the things, and that helps Re-Enchanting go far and wide.
But today we have an episode with a bit of a twist. This October marks Disney's 100th birthday, and seeing as Disney are in the enchantment business, we thought we'd dedicate an episode of Re-Enchanting to its cultural impact. And to help us do so, we have two wonderful guests joining us.
Yes, so I'll introduce the first one, Yaroslav Sky-Walker. So you already win the best name contest in the room.
A very Disney name, if I may say so.
Yeah, so we'll just put that out there and move on. Is the assistant priest of Holy Trinity Church in Sloane Square. He is married to Amy and they have two children, Lisa and the very new Misha. So congratulations on that.
Thank you very much.
And in his spare time, he reads theology and writes many film reviews, many of which you can find on Seen and Unseen. So that's a nice little plug there.
Thank you very much.
And Esmé Partridge also joins us. She's a writer and MPhil candidate in the philosophy of religion at the University of Cambridge. And she also works at the intersection of religion and politics, focusing on religious freedom and interfaith relations. So welcome both to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Before we get into Disney as a cultural phenomenon, so before we go wide with it, I just want to get a sense of where we'll sit with Disney. So if you could tell me your relationship with the franchise, any favourite films, and just how you sort of remember it playing out, particularly in your childhood. So Yaroslav, if we start with you, you and Disney.
Yes, well, I was born in the early 90s. So as I was growing up, it was Disney's second great renaissance, I think people have called it. And I was trying to remember, I think Mulan might be the first film I ever saw in the cinema as a 5 or 6 year old.
Oh, nice.
And then I had all of the greats and all of the modern greats on VHS and then DVD as I was growing up, and watched them quite religiously, I have to say.
Okay.
Favourite?
It has to be Mulan, favourite film.
Oh, yeah.
First one I ever saw, and the music is indestructible.
Maybe that is because it was the first one and it makes that impression.
Yeah.
I know what you mean. Esmé, what's your relationship with Disney?
So I was born in the millennium, so Disney's still very popular. It was very much the selection of films that we had in our school, which we'd play at the end of term, that kind of Friday afternoon film.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, my parents, and specifically my father, were actually quite anti-Disney, or rather anti-American influence altogether. So they didn't, they made a point of not having the Disney Channel.
Interesting.
So I associate Disney with watching it at friends' houses and at school, and it was kind of exciting for the very reason that it wasn't really there in my own household.
Yeah, I have that. My parents were anti it, but we just couldn't afford it. So I have the exact same thing.
Yes.
Like the Disney Channel is like a sleepover luxury. That's what's in my mind as well. My name's Belle, so I won't even go into what my favourite Disney film is.
Whole songs about you, Belle, in the Disney repertoire.
Yeah.
I seem, one of my early memories of cinema is probably The Little Mermaid. I think that was probably the first Disney film I saw. Was that late 80s, early 90s? I can't remember.
89.
89. There you go.
I knew we were gonna enjoy.
We've got
it
a Disney expert with us,
do.
evidently. Here.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, so dig deep for this one. Most underrated Disney film or character?
I would say Fantasia. And I think the reason it's probably not quite so appreciated these days is that I don't think it's very well suited to the modern attention span. I mean, it's a very long film. And it's somewhere between a classical music concert and an experimental cartoon. But for that reason, I think it's really quite groundbreaking. It's philosophically quite interesting as well. There's this almost kind of German romantic undertone really to the whole thing, and you know, you sort of got all these very, at the time, exciting animations to, you know, Beethoven and Tarkovsky, and it really is enchanting, I think, in the truest sense of the term.
Great.
I'd have to say The Black Cauldron.
Oh,
I can't remember, late 70s, early 80s. And I became obsessed with it because for a while it was one of the only Disney films we actually had on VHS. So I would watch it as children do over and over and over again. And later in life, I realized it's based on Welsh mythology. And there's a young hero protagonist. He has to do something to defeat a horned demon king. There's a black cauldron. There are fairies. Its narrative structure is a little looser and more meandering than your traditional Disney film. But I think as I've gotten older, seeing that link to Welsh mythology as well just makes it quite special. And it is genuinely brilliant and wasn't as well received as I think it should have been.
There you go. Well, let's hear it for The Black Cauldron. I guess we didn't even need to tell anyone what Disney is. It's just something everyone knows. It's an iconic sort of brand, and yes, celebrating obviously 100 years this month. Why has it just become such an all-encompassing phenomenon? I don't know, Esmé, if you have any thoughts on why it's been so big in our world.
I think it's possibly because it emerges sort of around a similar time as modern industrial modernity. So kind of on the one hand, you have this sort of Weberian kind of iron cage, this new kind of rationalized, quite a sort of is that a word? De-vernacular, a kind of loss of folk culture and tradition.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
And then I think Disney, although by no means is, you know, necessarily an authentic form of folk culture, it does at least revive this folk fantasy element that people like. And so I think that in stark contrast with this new industrial modernity is maybe quite appealing to people.
So the fairy tales that really marked those early films were kind of doing that effectively, bringing that back into people's lives.
Yeah, and I mean, I think if you think of that contrast, I'm talking about Weber just because I think it's so key to the enchantment subject, but also this, you know, he describes pre-modernity as this enchanted garden and modernity as an iron cage. And so I think in the context of that iron cage, the imagery of fairies and the kind of enchantment of nature as well, which you see in films like Fantasia, is really alluring to people. It speaks to something that's often lost in that brave new world.
Yeah, I watched speaking of the Little Mermaids, I watched the live action.
Oh yes, the recent remake.
Yeah, the recent remake. I watched that on the weekend, and so that's the first time in a good many years that I've watched one of those Disney classics. And I must say that intro where the star goes over the Disney castle and the music, if someone had asked me what would that spark in you, I'd say very little. But actually listening to it sparked so much. So they've so powerfully re-enchanted us. What do you think, Yaroslav? Do you see a similar thing? Did it just come at the right time?
I'd say definitely think it came at the right time. I would agree with Esmé wholeheartedly. I'd also say that I think just the sheer amount of output is the other thing. When I first started thinking about this podcast and what Disney means, I think like most of us could think of 10 films, probably all animated, that really summed Disney up. But then when I started researching its output, 50 films a year at some point. That might be an exaggeration, but at least 30 films a year. Not all animated. A lot of live action. They've produced far more films than they've ever actually directed themselves. So as well as going to pre-modern myths and folklore and reintroducing them to a new generation, they also they haven't stopped. And when you have so much output, you're going to get some really smashing hits that just bind the collective imagination as well.
That's so interesting, because when I was actually, right up until you mentioned it, Esmé, I hadn't even thought about the channel. My mind was just in those animated films. I hadn't thought about, your High School Musicals and your everything they're still doing. So you're right. It was just an absolute bombardment of enchantment. So,
and on top of that, there's the theme parks, obviously, all over the world. You've got, I've been to one of them, the one in California, and to Euro Disney as well. And that it's very much is about putting you into this magical world. It's got the different themed worlds anyway, and they're all tied into various films and things. But throughout it all, I think Disney have always pressed this idea of they want to enchant you. They want to put you in a different world, into kind of, an imaginary place. I mean, how successful have they been, would you say? I mean, is it just that you can lose yourself in a film for an hour or two? Have they kind of actually made an impact on the way we think about enchanting our culture, would you say? Yaroslav, what do you think?
I think they have, and going back to what Esmé was saying, I think they definitely have, as rationalism has sort of stormed its way through the culture. They have been quite a nice antidote. I think the fact that with a lot of the films, they've placed a very clear emphasis on innocence and reintroducing and protecting childhood innocence to a degree, having some fairly black and white storylines, having characters that are just good and bad, has meant that that they've done quite a powerful work in enchanting. I think also the focus on animation has been quite a big thing. I really struggled to put it into words when thinking about it, but I think there is something about the animated film and going back before the digital age, specifically hand-drawn animation. There's this extra step of imaginative creativity compared to doing something live action, which I think does enchant. There's I can't remember where Rowan Williams was giving a lecture about fiction and novels, and it was about novels ethical vehicles, in a sense, because they put you into a frame of mind that's almost like God, because to appreciate a novel, you have to appreciate the characters, you have to empathize with the characters. And I think animation does something in a different way, a bit like that. That extra creative endeavor in making the film work means that you're taking an extra step to suspend your disbelief and enter a world of
the
real
medium
wonder.
In that sense has helped to deliver that message. What do you think of that, Esmé?
I think that's a really good point, and I would agree. I mean, I think sometimes it's important to sort of question what do we mean by enchantment, and also ask the question of, are there different kinds of enchantment, and also are all of them good? Because I think maybe this is a cynical perspective on Disney, but I'm sure it's one that, maybe, Guy Debord or someone like that would have on Disney, is this idea of spectacle, and actually the notion of enchanting people and sort of engrossing them and kind of keeping them fixated in this imaginary world, yes, can be a positive thing and can inspire sort of the good within people, but at the same time can also be a distraction or a kind of spectacle, I suppose. And so I think the term enchantment is kind of loaded, because just because something excites your senses or arouses your imagination, that doesn't mean it's necessarily authentically sacred or good. It can also, as I say, be a kind of distraction or even a deception. That's a very negative view, but I suppose that would probably be a more critical take on the kind of enchantment that Disney provides. Is it really to sort of keep people in this fairy world as a kind of distraction from the harsh realities of that more iron cage society that's emerging at the same time?
Yeah, that made me, as I was thinking about this episode and sort of thinking, I was like, a question popped into my mind, because we've had 100 years of Disney being in our public consciousness. And like you say, we don't even need to explain what it is. That's how at the forefront it is. So what's interesting, following on from your question, Esmé, is there anything that we have here in 2023, for better or for worse, that simply would not be there if it weren't for 100 years worth of Disney? And I know that's a really tricky and abstract question, but like, have they just sat us down for an hour and a half at a time? Have they just got us to theme parks, or has their impact broken the banks of themselves, if you know what I mean? Yaroslav, you're looking very pensive. Do you want us to go to Esmé first?
Please.
Hit us, Esmé.
I mean, I guess going back to my earlier point a bit, I think that had Disney not existed, it's possible that we might have completely lost that love of folk culture and of those traditional fairy tales. And I think it has, in a way, preserved that. I mean, at the same time, yes, it's brought this kind of hegemony in a way of sort of what, that you might lose much more sort of niche and culturally specific folk tales to these big famous ones, which everyone knows in Europe and America, because of Disney. So maybe it has kind of monopolized myths and fairy tales.
That's interesting, yeah.
But nonetheless, I think it has preserved them. And so I would commend it for that and say that may well be something that wouldn't be the case had Disney not existed.
Yeah.
I mean, something I've noticed in a way is that in more recent years, there's been a trend towards, rather than simply retelling in the Disney way, those classic fairy tales like Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, and even, Beauty and the Beast and so on, which were given still a fairly kind of standard treatment. There's been almost a subverting sometimes of the stories. So now you get films like Maleficent, which is sort of told from the perspective of the witch who cast the spell on Sleeping Beauty and all that kind of thing, and you suddenly realise the life she had that led her to those choices, that kind of thing. Or I don't think this is Disney, but The Wizard of Oz and that sort of thing, where now you've got Wicked, which is kind of telling it from the point of view of the Wicked Witch of the West and so on. So do you think like we've almost got to the point now where we feel like, oh, those are a bit too simplistic, those sort of fairy tale understandings of life, and they are too black and white in that sense, that you mentioned that word yourself, Yaroslav? I think that are Disney and the world kind of feeling like we need to move beyond those sort of ways of telling these stories?
I think Disney definitely is, and I think they are probably following a broader trend. C.S. Lewis was writing about this trend after the Second World War, and slightly decrying the fact that you can't seem to have a hero who's a hero anymore, or a villain who's a villain. Everyone has to be complex. Now that Disney's taken over Marvel, you've seen this in the Marvel films especially. I'm not sure they've actually had a genuinely just bad, evil villain at any point anymore. They've always got a purpose where, there was this discourse after the end of the first phase of the Marvel films. Thanos was right.
Yes.
There is this great utilitarian sense in which destroying half of the organic matter of the universe is a good thing. I'm not too fond of it. I'm a Christian. I do think that there is such a thing as just unalloyed good and the unalloyed absence of good. And I think that we are losing something if we don't have a vehicle, especially of, which Disney was, I suppose, through from its very beginning, of moral instruction to our children, where we can't just say, this is just a bad act. This is a good act. This is a bad person doing a bad thing. This is a good person. So I would.
I mean, at the same time, life is more nuanced than that, I suppose, in defense of Disney's slightly postmodern turn, because, very rarely is someone just an evil person. They're usually a whole combination of things that have led them to do an evil act. But I don't know, Esmé, what do you think? Do you think that this is just Disney kind of being more realistic? You said that maybe they were distracting us with fairy tales was one thing. Maybe they're just entering the real world a bit more with these sorts of stories.
I mean, I probably would side with you on this. I think that essentialization is actually quite necessary for a fairy tale. I mean, it is supposed to be giving a simplistic account in the same way that fairy tales usually comprise a stock of archetypes, a sort of set of fixed personas, and they are self-aware of the fact that they are generalizing and they are essentializing, but that's quite necessary, especially to a younger audience. I think actually having those tropes and quite clear-cut ideas of good and evil, and those being reflected in personalities quite graphically sometimes is a good thing. And I would also say that I'm skeptical that Disney have really, gone about this postmodern turn in any way that's kind of really meaningful. I think it's probably more to accommodate the demands of that postmodern society itself. It's kind of, it's almost like that's the market, isn't it?
Yes.
It's people don't like these clear-cut ideas of good and evil, and so Disney, just in attempt to please that audience, is possibly trying to complexify.
And I think you can push back against the use of the word realism, because I mean they are more realistic in a sense. They reflect the state of material psychological existence, but behind that reality, there is the greater reality of Almighty God, and Almighty God is, actually ultimately simple, and that simplicity is good and love. There's no sort of nuance of, well, maybe if I did just kill this person,
right,
then the calculus of benefit would be there is just pure unabounding love. And yet, as Esmé said, showing that in archetypes, again, especially for children who don't necessarily think about things in the nuanced way a 20th century French philosopher who can't escape the sound of his own voice would. They sometimes do just need things put out in black and white.
What's interesting, I think, about Disney, and we're talking specifically about this good and evil, is that it takes a lot of profound belief to assume that good will always beat evil. And if that belief is draining out of the world, like when Martin Luther King said, the arc of history is long, but it does bend towards justice. That's a profoundly like faith-fueled, not necessarily even Christian faith-fueled, although he was, and I would say that it is. But do you know what I mean? That requires a lot of faith. So it's interesting that it's almost like our Disney sort of saying, do we still hold, by what grounds, on what grounds can we hold this absolutely undying belief that good will always win? And you have the same in like Narnia and Tolkien, but where their belief in those things came from. And it's almost like Disney, like, can we tell people that good always triumphs? Can we tell people that like innocence and purity win out over evil? Can we still do that? Is that still okay? Is that true? So that's quite interesting as well. There is a lot of talk about Disney at the moment, about needing to rethink it, about it rethinking itself, as we've already touched upon. And what I find really interesting about that conversation is that it's happening all across the cultural spectrum, which is really interesting. I'm reluctant to be so binary about it, but you have some very progressive voices saying Disney needs to change, and you have some very sort of more conservative voices saying the same thing, but for very different reasons. So I'd love to just touch on those with you and kind of get your thoughts on those, if that's okay. And let's start with sort of what, I say this in air quotes, the more progressive voices are saying. So we're about to have a new Snow White, and our new Snow White, Rachel Zegler, I think it is, she's sort of been in the headlines for saying, the 1937 storyline will not hold up in 2024 as it will be, and therefore it's radically changed. And she's detailed how, and she sees that as a really good thing. And also, if you look at any of the remakes, they've slightly tweaked it, to sort of better sit with our modern sensibilities. What do you think about that? Are you like, yes, these are being shown to children and they need to be rethought, and we shouldn't hold things just because we hold them? Or are you sort of not in that place? Esmé, should we go to you first?
I mean, I think I'd have to see it to see the way that it's done, because I think sometimes when people try and rewrite these stories, they do it in a way which feels intentionally subversive, and that kind of detracts from the story itself. Do you know what I mean? When they try and remake something really just in a way that's so polemically charged almost against itself, I think that can often just be, well, it's not really very interesting to watch. And I suppose I also fear that there's a danger that without knowing it, without realizing it, those who want to remake these films, they're actually just as guilty as imposing an ideology onto it. And the chances are that the writers of a film in the 1950s, they're just going along with the stereotypes at the time. I'm not saying that's necessarily good, or that doesn't need reflection, but they're not actually making something to be political. Whereas I think there's a danger that when people try to rewrite these things, they usually are explicitly being political, and I would be quite keen to sort of keep that out of fiction and out of Disney.
Yaroslav?
No, I'd absolutely agree. I think the first point to agree with Esmé is that it's often just done really badly, where they take the bones of the story and then they put in 2 or 3 soliloquies into the mouths of characters that just wouldn't speak like that, and where actually the rest of the script of the remake and the rest of the film, it jars so horribly. So let's start with actually doing it well, and then we can give it a fair showing. I'd have to see it. But I think my issue with it, and I am a social and moral conservative, I suppose, but I'm very happy for there to be the public discourse and conversation in the culture. My question about it would be, why do it in Snow White? This is possibly one of the most beloved things Disney has ever produced. I mean, it stands in the top 5 in, I think, any poll that's ever taken. It is possible to do this not tarnishing a beloved artifact that people have invested so much of themselves into. It's not Disney, but Shrek did that really well, and that's a DreamWorks production, but it does it brilliantly. It skewers all of those archetypes. It still manages to be quite meaningful at the end. But you see, Disney did that in 2007 with Enchanted, where a Disney character comes into the real world and starts to break some of those Prince Charming tropes, because when Prince Charming comes to rescue her, she insists, no, I've learned a bit about what relationships mean. We're going to go on a first date. I'm not just going to let you kiss me and it'll all be fine. And in the end, it works out very well. So yes, like Esmé, I'd need to see it, but don't do it with Snow White. Make something. Be genuinely imaginative. That's what propelled Disney into what it is.
Well, as a bit of a social conservative, then Yaroslav, and be interested in Esmé's take on this as well.
You put it out there.
I really wish I hadn't said it.
As soon as you said it, I thought,
Well, only that one of the trends in that sense, and perhaps it's very understandable, is that Disney, both in its remakes but also in its fresh films, has in a sense aimed, I think, to give its female leads and parts more of their own agency, not simply there as the princess to be woken by Prince Charming and so on. I got this very much. There was a switch when the Frozen film came out, and that was a film where, for the first time, I've forgotten the sort of index that people give this term, but essentially there was a kind of certain type of rating you could give a film as to how much the main female leads were dependent essentially on a romantic relationship with a male character, and this didn't have that. These were just female leads in their own right, and that was seen as applauded as something that was good. I mean, is that a problem from your perspective, that in a sense it's being pushed in that direction to say, look, we need to kind of understand that some of these old ways in which women were portrayed in Disney films need to be re-engaged?
I would say it's a problem, but let me pass that so that I don't.
I've given you a very tricky question.
It's a fantastic question. I don't think it was a problem with Frozen, because Frozen, the message there was still about the fundamental importance of relationship and connection. And it was a very good spiritual and Christian message, because there it's the dependence of sisters on each other and the sisterly bond. And my wife is one of 3 sisters. She loves Frozen for that very reason. She was so happy that it wasn't true love's kiss. It was I think it's the kiss between the 2 sisters that actually solves the problem. So I don't think there is a problem that the female characters are being given more of a voice or more agency. I think the problem is when that agency is singular and absolutely individualized. I would say the same thing about a film where a male character is just the hero. He doesn't need anyone. He does it on his own. I think so much of Disney, going back to Snow White, Snow White relies on the 7 dwarfs. The 7 dwarfs rely on each other. They learn to rely on her. She becomes something of a mother figure to her, getting as much from them as they do from her. We'll park True Love's kiss from Prince Charming for a second, but there is always, nevertheless, this sense that community and relationship and loving relationship, truly loving relationship, is important. This was the problem. I watched the remake of Mulan. It is my favorite Disney film, and I try not to hate things. I really didn't like it for a number of reasons. Getting rid of the music and getting rid of an Eddie Murphy dragon, 2 massive problems to begin with. But in the remake of Mulan, she's absolutely brilliant from the age of 8. She can already do everything. She doesn't go through any sort of actual cycle of growth in the film, except to understand that she is actually already brilliant.
Right.
And that's how she wins the day. She wins physical contests. She can't actually, in real life, win. Just by going, no, I am actually great, and I've been held down. And there is definitely an important message there that needs to be made, but it gets made too much of, and it leads to this absolute fetishization of the individual, which I do think is a problem.
Esmé, any thoughts on?
I completely agree with that, and again, sort of without wanting to stray into too much controversial territory, I think that's for me anyway one of the issues I would have with modern feminism, and indeed the way that is reflected in these new films, is that instead of trying to work towards a healthy, strong, cooperative relationship between the sexes, it's asserting independence in a way which I see more as symptomatic of a kind of capitalist, sort of individualistic, atomized society, rather than anything I think is that empowering. I think the most empowering thing is to be able to work together within a community and be humble, I think, and recognize the need for cooperation. And yes, I would also really agree with your point about, well, why do they sort of choose to rewrite old stories? Why don't they just create new ones? Yeah. And again, I think that's one of the biggest issues I have with this kind of culture of, sort of constantly kind of revising and criticizing the past, is that it sort of seems to destroy more than create. And since you mentioned social conservatism, I guess it's that Scrutonian sentiment, isn't it? That good things are easily destroyed but not easily created. And absolutely, I think with these new Disney remakes, they would much rather kind of deconstruct, as it were, and ultimately destroy the original storylines rather than actually innovate and make something new that's going to inspire people for what it is, not just as a criticism of what it was.
Yeah. So playing devil's advocate, then, do you not see anything I don't know if problematic's the right word, but do you not see there needs to be a discussion around things such as True Love's kiss, particularly when one of the recipient of the kiss is unconscious, etc., etc. How would you, surely, if we're giving those films to children, surely there needs to be some slight conversation, or do you think that that's really just overthinking it and they don't really think that it's okay for people to kiss them when they're asleep, even am I overthinking it?
I did actually struggle with this question because I'm kind of in two minds, because I think on the one hand, basically everything I just said, I am quite skeptical towards sort of deconstructing and revising it, mostly because it's always just overtly political, and I don't think that's a good look. But then I do actually sympathise with that perspective. I think there is a reason why these conversations are being had. And even if it is a small thing in a film like that, then especially with young people watching, that could shape what they deem to be normal. So I am sort of tentative towards this whole question of kind of modernization. But I will say that I do sympathise with your point. I don't know, what do you think?
I'm not 100% sure that when Walt Disney started creating animations for children, he wanted to push a narrative about female submission. I'm slightly skeptical of that. I think we're in danger of just agreeing throughout the entire podcast. I think Esmé's laid it out very well. I wouldn't deny that there are conversations to be had about a non-consensual kiss, in animation, in Spanish football, in anything like that. This is a particularly pertinent question now. Yeah. Again, just going back to children and their innocence, I grew up on all of those Disney films, and at no point did I think that the non-consensual kiss of a sleeping person was a good thing. I think children have a much better ability than adults, actually, both to because they are so innocent, to see the true reality behind the reality. They can suspend their disbelief and live in a world of dragons and poisoned apples, curses of sleep, and True Love's kiss, while at the same time recognizing that, okay, that's not necessarily how I live my life every single day. And just to defend True Love's kiss for a second, I think we also need to remember that just within the structure of that narrative, that is always their true love. It's yes. They've deconstructed it with non-True Love's kiss, and then it's definitely problematic. But there's an element of destiny and fate there, which can definitely lead people into bad patterns of thinking, but also a quite healthy in a sense.
One area where I would like to come in defense of Disney's sort of modern take on things is I have appreciated the move away from the kind of ridiculously proportioned heroines who are, beautiful in ways that most people can't aspire to kind of actually increasingly in more recent films a more kind of realistic representation of the diversity of how people look. I'm thinking of Encanto in particular, where the young heroine is not this kind of svelte 6.5 foot blonde person.
You see that in Moana as well.
And a lot more kind of, and I've actually thought I've appreciated that, because actually that is just more realistic. These characters I didn't find any less enthralling or interesting because of it. But I wonder whether that might be something where a move towards a sort of modern sensibilities might be an advantage. But feel free to disagree with me if you do disagree. Esmé, any thoughts on that?
I think I'm going to pass on that one. I think I think it just points to a general sort of chasm between, do you view film and indeed art in general as something that's supposed to be realistic and representational, or idealistic and aspirational. And I definitely think there's a point to be made about, well, you know, the media do have a huge responsibility as to what they are going to make the aspirational, coveted ideal. And, you know, historically that has had very, very severe consequences. I mean, you've only got to look at sort of modelling, you know, models from the 90s and the wave of eating disorders, which was so obviously a consequence of that. So I would agree that films and indeed anyone who's putting content into such a huge public space with such a huge audience does have that responsibility for shaping the ideals. I think it's just a question of, you know, how can we ensure that ideals are sort of positive? I think we need a new idealism which is based on virtue and moral character rather than superficial things like perfect appearance. So I would probably agree with you in some respect. Yeah.
Again, too much agreement, but yes, I have no qualms. I think I agree. It's probably very positive that there is more of that sense of representation. You know, Esmé brought up character. I think going back to those older films where that more traditional standard of beauty was on display, I'm struggling to think of a film where that unattainable standard of beauty, and again, they were cartoons, was the main thing about the person. You know, Snow White and Cinderella and Belle from Beauty and the Beast, you know, are all meant to be incredibly beautiful, almost unattainably beautiful characters. But the thing that actually makes them engaging characters is that they're all just very morally good people. They're good, they're kind, they're caring. That's what enchants you about them, not so much their appearance.
It's only that it was often, I suppose, immorality was often associated with the ugly hag, you know, the witch.
Yeah.
And so, again, that's, I think, something we're perhaps moving away from, because if you only ever see beauty associated with goodness and ugliness associated with evil, then that maybe is a problematic. Esmé?
I'm really glad you raised that point. And it reminds me of all the Roald Dahl controversy, actually, because something that Roald Dahl almost always did was depict evil characters as ugly,
yes,
and good characters as beautiful. And I actually think, though, that from a Christian perspective, but more broadly theist perspective, I think there's really something quite profound about that, actually, because it points to the convertibility of the transcendental. So the idea that there's an equation between the true, the good, and the beautiful, and so something which is truly beautiful is necessarily also good. And I think, actually, while yes, we can be in danger of essentializing people and you know, we don't want to reduce things too much to physical appearance, I think by presenting, particularly to a younger audience, an evil character as ugly and a good character as beautiful, there's actually a very profound symbolic significance to that, because you're instilling it in their minds basically this very quite theological idea of the convertibility of those transcendentals. So from that perspective, I am probably in favour with.
You prefer the archetype over the sort of the modern.
Well, I'm a Platonist, so I would say.
I'm glad we got both Scruton and the transcendentals into a podcast. But I think the other thing to say about that, going off what Esmé said, is that a lot of those ugly characters do they make themselves.
They turn themselves
ugly.
Right,
So I mean, I think the classic example is in Snow White. The Queen is actually she's beautiful. If anything, she's more sort of got a more imposing stark beauty than Snow White does. But she turns herself ugly through sort of an act of turning in on herself.
Right.
And so I think there's again the reality behind the reality. There's an even deeper message which a child especially could pick up on, of that if I think nothing but of myself, and if I'm so focused, again, the Beast, you know, the actually a very handsome man in the beginning. It's through his own selfishness that he becomes the Beast. That if I am so self-obsessed and focused on myself to the exclusion of everyone else, I become ugly on the inside, and that will change me.
And in the film, that's expressed as ugly.
That's expressed in a physical sense, but at no point I think do they make it. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think the mutability of being, you know, good, being ugly and evil, and then being able to transform yourself into good is also a deeply Christian message, because it's, you know, your evil is not inherent. Well, maybe if you believe in total depravity, then it is. But that's we move away from that.
No Calvinists on this side of the table.
Yeah, but the idea that there is this potential to become good and that it's not predestined and you know, you can change. That's something to be commended.
Yeah, that's really interesting about they sort of do it to themselves. But I suppose the issue with physical beauty being moral beauty is that where we would say that one is objective, the other is undeniably subjective, and what people are being fed what is a very subjective view of what beauty is, and then they're being told that this must be objective because moral beauty is goodness, just is goodness. So if I'm showing that through beauty, then this beauty is just beauty. Do you think there's that element to it?
Potentially. But again, I'd be skeptical about just how much that forms people's understanding of goodness, truth, beauty, and especially of themselves. I mean, you could draw a line between the Disney princesses of old and the modern spate of eating disorders. I think you have to work quite hard to get to that line. I think there's so many other things in the world. I mean, I think going back to Justin's original question, I think those were the subjective beauty standards of the day. They wanted to create beautiful people to show, what goodness and beauty can be, and so they portrayed them in that way. And that is slowly changing. And no, I don't think any of us would say that that's a bad thing. But the point is, we're not meant to think that somebody like Moana or a character in Coco are ugly. We are meant to think that they are beautiful, and I think people do. It's the standards may have changed. I don't think the films are trying to impose an absolute sense of beauty that everybody fits into in that sense. I think that's giving them too much credit, if anything.
I mean, you've also got concerns, especially coming out of the USA and Florida, where one of the big Disney worlds is based, and where Ron DeSantis, a conservative candidate for president, is based, of whether Disney are pushing a very progressive agenda. A lot of people have accused them of pushing a sort of LGBT, quote unquote, woke agenda in some of their recent films and series and so on. There's even been, people calling for boycotts on Disney and so on. Now, I just wonder what you think of that sort of that other end of the spectrum, where people feel like, hey, this has gone too far. We feel like we're being preached to politically at this point, rather than it just being family entertainment or whatever. Esmé, any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it does reflect ultimately a desire to appeal to the modern audience. I think I think that is how the market works, I guess, doesn't it? It is about supply and demand, and so I think that if tides were to turn and we found ourselves in a West that was more socially conservative, not that seems very sort of likely of happening, but like, say, hypothetically, then I think in turn Disney would also probably try and reflect that. I mean, it is a major corporation, it has got financial
the profit is
interest.
The bottom line, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, I wouldn't usually give an analysis that's that reductive. I mean, I'm sure people high up at Disney probably do quite strongly believe in these ideas and see their duty as being to propagate them in some way. So I don't think that the protesters are completely unjustified. I think because also, these changes have come in very, very quickly. I mean, a lot of quite sort of normal opinions on these things 5-10 years ago have been quite radically questioned, and I think that does unsettle people, because they think, oh, hang on, I'm not evil. I just believe these certain norms, and I think that is it's the pace of change, I think, that unsettles a lot of people.
Yaroslav?
Yeah, I think, to be reductive for a moment, I think Esmé's right. I think there is a profit incentive behind it. The loudest voices in our society commenting on social issues these days do seem to be more progressive voices. And I don't think that Bob Iger is an LGBTQ plus ally. I think he's a man who wants to make as much money for his company as possible, and so will try to reflect what he sees in the press and in his social circles. Again, I am a social moral conservative, but part of that involves a healthy public discourse. So I'm not opposed to any of this being in the media or in the culture if it is genuinely reflecting a conversation. I don't think you need to boycott it. I think you just don't take your children to see it. It's that simple. You don't need to be quite so intentional about it. There are parents to a large degree. It's getting harder and harder in the digital age, but they do shape the viewing habits of their children. You cannot take them to see a film. My biggest problem, again, is more an aesthetic point. It's done really, really badly. It's either crowbarred in a way that completely detracts from the rest of the film, or it's really, really throwaway, almost to be unnatural, almost to be what was the point. I think the Lightyear movie got into hot water for featuring a gay kiss. It was one gay kiss. There was nothing necessary about it. It didn't make any broader point. It was almost put in there as an elephant trap for conservative viewers to foment a bit of trouble. So yeah, I just think it's done very badly. If I saw a real genuine attempt at it, that you could consider this was a good piece of art, that would be something interesting to discuss. The final thing I'd say on it is I think these are very American conservative discussions, and not to sound like your dad for a second. I really do think it's problematic how much of our social and political discourse we seem to be being allowed to be molded and influenced by an American discussion that actually is, I mean, American conservatism and British conservatism may have started in similar soil, but they've grown into radically different trees. And so I don't think we should be taking too many talking cues from angry men and women on YouTube and TikTok wanting to boycott things.
On either side of the
spectrum.
spectrum.
On either side of the debate, absolutely.
Just Americanization. Well, I say that talking about Disney, but...
Interesting points. So if it was done really well, would you still have the same issues, do you think? That was an interesting point you made at the end.
If it was done really well, I may have personal issues, personal moral issues about a portrayal in a film. Of course, I would. I have moral qualms about lots of things that I don't think are necessarily good for society or for the individual. I don't want to ban anything. I'm a very wet liberal in that respect. I don't particularly want to ban too many things. If it was done well, I would see it as something that has merit to be in the public discourse. It's when it's done really badly. I don't want to ban it. I just want to say this is just an ugly thing. Not because the thing it's portraying is necessarily ugly, but it's just been done in such a bad way. It's not a good piece of art. So it's not really worthy of discussion.
Yeah.
You can say the same thing about American films. The whole spate of particularly right-wing Christian films about the rapture, for example, they're just really bad films.
Yeah.
Terrible scripts and bad performances, and they're shot badly. Don't ban them, just don't watch them.
I mean, so what's your overall take 100 years on, since, I don't know, that first little cartoon of Steamboat Willie or whatever it was that Walt Disney created? Do you think Disney have carried that mantle well? Do you think they're doing a good job of what they were first, created to do in that sense?
I mean, I think if you mean enchantment,
yes.
Disney as an enchanting force, is that still the case? I think no, but I think that's because in general, it's not specific to Disney. It's just that enchantment nowadays, I think, is much more democratized in the sense that whereas once you had these mass institutions, even like the BBC, you had Disney, these major companies that everybody is exposed to, they are kind of in control of a sort of, manipulating the kind of symbols and the imaginative life of the masses. That, those are no longer having that kind of effect. Nowadays, everybody has a smartphone. People are able to access and create very, very individualized content. And I mean, something I've written about quite a lot is the question of enchantment and TikTok and social media. Because on TikTok, you see all these really quite fascinating trends of, young women, for example, getting into witchcraft or
Witch talk,
yes.
I read your article. It was fascinating.
Oh, thank you. And also, these other ideas like reality shifting, people basically using TikTok to re-enchant their lives. And they do so on a basis that is highly individualized, it's highly customized. And so I think in this world where we have these technologies and people are able to create their own meaning and create their own enchantments, something like Disney just isn't going to have the same hold over the imagination. It's not going to have that same power. In that sense, I mean, the demise of Disney and its influence is almost a bit like the decline of institutional religion. You go from having this collective kind of hub of kind of symbols, things which shape the imagination of the populace. You go from having that to a sort of much more postmodern, people doing it for themselves, alternative spirituality. Likewise, the kind of enchantment that one could get from Disney could now be accessed on TikTok or something like that. So I think that's probably that would be my verdict.
What's your verdict, Yaroslav?
I'd agree. I don't think they're doing it very well anymore. I would agree with Esmé's analysis. There is too much choice. Was having this conversation before the podcast. We don't live in a world of 3, 4, 5 channels anymore. We live in a world where you can access exactly what you want, tailor-made by an algorithm for you. So that in itself is not Disney's fault. It's just living in that world. But I think it's just gotten too big. It's ironic, actually, as the ability to get what you want from culture and your own version of enchantment has grown, so has Disney, and Disney has been buying up all sorts of other companies. It now owns Lucasfilm, it owns Marvel. I think it's gotten too big to actually be able to put in the time and effort to be genuinely creative. I think you need to, when you get to a certain size and you're just constantly pumping out content, you turn in on yourself a little bit. They're not bored enough as a company. They don't have enough time and space to just sit to produce something original. They're going back to existing intellectual property that they know makes money and pumping out more and more versions of that. There's diminishing returns.
Ever more, spin-offs of Star Wars and ever more remakes of the old films.
If you read the Star Wars novels, there's this entire world post the original trilogy of it's not in the canon anymore, but the extended universe of Star Wars. People love it. It is dull as sin. They go into detail on every single planet and what species is living there.
You could do the same with Tolkien, to be fair, in Lord of the Rings.
I have.
And Tolkien does.
Yeah.
He does. The history of every tree branch
But
is in his books.
I guess that's in the way that Tolkien did enchant a whole generation of readers. And maybe Amazon have slightly spoiled his legacy, according to some purists, with their latest version of it. I don't know. Are we just living in a disenchanted age where it's harder to do that? Could even Tolkien manage, I suppose, to have the same effect today that he once had?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Sorry to chuck a deep one.
No, I'm looking forward to the answer to this one.
Ooh, it's a good question. I think I would probably, I suppose, reiterate my point about how it's just really hard to capture an audience in that way. There's this book which I think is probably quite relevant to this conversation called The Romantic Ethic and the Spirit of Consumerism by an author called Colin Campbell. So it's obviously a play on the Weberian idea. And his point is very much that whereas we've gone from a society where enchantment, kind of that romantic kind of enchantment is belonging to these kind of vast cultural phenomena, it now is so much more personalized, and consumerism has allowed us to sort of experience that enchantment at that very personal level. So it's not that there aren't great authors, although, well, that's another question. Are there still people who are capable of writing such works? But I think the culture would make it very hard for something to be received in that way.
I'd agree. I think part of it's all been agreement. I think part of what made Disney the cultural force that it was that when it was first founded, I don't assume every person on the original Disney staff was a believing Christian, but it's that Tom Holland point of it's the radioactivity in the air that we breathe. They were living in a culture. They were swimming in Christian waters that believed in transcendental ideas and could tell stories that pointed beyond the individual and beyond the world to enchant. And we don't live in that age anymore. And I think Disney's too big and chasing money. So I think 100 years is quite a good run. I think it's probably time, if Disney can't be taken over, for a new small independent animation studio.
Ooh, this is a hot take.
Doesn't have to be staffed entirely by Christians, of course, but people who actually believe in something outside of their immediate reality are the people who create enchantment. If you don't have that as the warp and weft of your life, you're not going to produce something enchanting. You're going to produce something materialist and basic that will distract for an hour and a half, take you out of the drudgery of this Marxist hellhole of capitalism and alienation from one's work. Marx described it as a hellhole. We are not living in a Marxist hellhole. Don't at me on Twitter. But it takes people who would actually believe in something beyond themselves and beyond this age and this world. And those people do exist. It's much harder to get their voices out there, but it's not impossible. And God is good. He'll build them up when it's time.
They absolutely do exist. And I think about Francis Bufford. We had him on in season 1, and he said, we are meaning-making creatures. Inherently, we can't stop making enchantments. Which, interesting, framing it with you, good, bad, everything in between enchantments. But I like to think that's still the case. I like to think there's still a belief-shaped need within us. And like you say, I like to think those people and those stories are still out there, and there may be a resurgence. I like to think our imaginations are, not completely done away with and things like that. But this has been such a great conversation. We could go on for another hour, and I'd be quite happy.
Yes, but we
won't.
will have to draw it to a close here. Perhaps we'll meet at the 200th anniversary.
That's the transhumanism.
That is, yeah.
But Walt Disney himself was cryogenically frozen.
That's right.
So maybe we could
have him
on.
Yeah.
We could have him on for the next
5 heads in jars, Futurama style.
It sounds like a Disney movie. Anyway, thank you so much for being with us, Yaroslav and Esmé. Great to have you on this special edition of the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you.